In this video, we're going to talk about radio buttons and checkbox objects. Radio buttons and checkboxes both have some properties. They have a value property and they have a checked property. And we'll see how we can work with those properties in just a minute. So let's look at some HTML code that generates some radio buttons and a checkbox. Here we have a label that says contact me by, and then we have a radio button control. So it's input type equals radio. And then we have another radio button, input type equals radio, right underneath it. Notice this one says the name equals contact, ID equals text. And this one, it also has a value of text, and it is set to checked. So we're using that checked property. We're setting it right there. So by default, we're asking the user, do they want to be contacted by text or a text message or by email? By default, the text message will be checked when the form gets loaded. I want you to notice the names of both these radio buttons are the same, and they have to be the same. If you've used radio buttons before, you know that you can only have one of them checked at a time. And the way their browser knows which radio buttons are in that group of things that can only be checked one at a time is if they have the same name. However, they do need a different ID. Okay, so each radio button has to have a different ID so we know which one was actually checked. Okay, so names are the same, IDs are different with radio buttons. Now it's the opposite when we get down here. We have a checkbox control. So input type equals checkbox. They have to have a unique name, and the name and ID attributes have to be set to the same value. So if you look here, the checkbox has a name and ID of accept. Okay, so this is like, do you agree to our terms of service? And you check this box if you do agree. And the value would be accept if you've checked it. So let's look at some code to get the radio button and checkbox values. So let's look here. We'll let contact equal null. So we're setting it to a null value. And then we're going to look, did they check text? And if they check text, we're going to get the value that they typed in there, and we'll set that as the contact. If they selected email, we're going to get the value out of the email, and we're going to set that as the method for contact. And then down here, we're going to use that. If contact equals text, then we can do some processing for what's going to happen to send them a text message. Else, if contact equals email, we'll write some code in here that does some processing if they decided they wanted email. And if neither one of those were clicked, we'd alert you must select a contact method. Now, one thing to point out here is if you start with one checked like we did up here, it's almost impossible for them to have one that's unchecked. There are ways to do it, but you'd have to do some tricky things. So it's always good to make sure that they've checked and do the input validation here on our client side when we program. And also note that when you send information from a form to a server, it's going to do some input validation as well. But it's going to take time for that information to get to the server, be validated. And then if there's an error, you have to generate an entire new web page to send back to the user to ask them to fix their mistakes. So we usually do input validation on the client side using JavaScript as well as on the server side. It's better to catch things before the forms get submitted on the client side. All right, so the last thing it's doing is going to look to see if that accept box has been checked, and if it does, we can do some processing. At that point, we'll probably be sending it to the user using the submit. But if they did not select the terms of service, we pop up an alert, say, hey, we're not going to submit this. You must accept our terms of service. So those are some ways you can check radio buttons and checkbox values. You can also use code to set the radio button and checkbox values. So we can set the .text field .checked to false, email .checked to false. We can take the checkbox and set check to true if we want to.